So today I'm going to be making a damp box. This is my typical damp box. Inside are little parts that I've made when I'm making groups of them that I can store for indefinitely and still be able to use them. So like this pink clay is 2 or 3 years old and the pieces in there are still flexible and they're just right to attach to the pieces when I'm working with them. It's the right hardness. And you know, anything from thrown pieces to hand-built pieces I keep in them. Underneath is a little bit of plaster, and that's really what we're going to be making today. So I originally started making damp boxes because the bottom of a plastic bin has these ridges, and I was storing my parts in these little plastic bins so I could keep them wet when I was working with them in just one set. So I might throw 10 body parts and then all the parts that go on it. And by the time I assembled one whole piece, that the little parts were starting to dry out. So I was putting them in plastic bins. Except I was marring them on those corners. So I said, well, I'll pour a little plaster in there so it's a nice flat surface. Well, in doing that, I found that those little pieces never dried out. So like if I put them in wet, which was, you know, what I was trying to do is to keep them wet. So I was putting them wet and they weren't drying at all. So I said, well, shoot, if I get them to leather hard, I'd be able to keep them there for a long time. And, you know, I'd make a set and have like a few pieces left over and I'd keep them in the bin and then come back the next time I was making stuff and there would be, you know, a set of 4 or 5 pieces that were still ready to use. So I continued it. So what you'll need is a plastic bin with a lid. They don't need a seal or anything, as long as it's a plastic and there aren't holes in the top. Some of the bigger ones have holes up here. You want one without holes. You need a shore form. You need a bucket that's dedicated just for plaster. And you need water. Other precaution would be in your sink. You do not want to pour any of the plaster down the sink. You should have a bin or a bucket or something that you wash your hands off and that you wash the tools off. That should be in the sink. So, real easy, you take your bucket, you pour about the volume that you want into your bin, into the bucket. With the plaster, it'll make a tad bit more, but you don't want too much, and if you have too little, then you gotta make more. For the most part, you can't go wrong with how much you have, because it's not a strength thing, it's not an absorbency thing. As long as there's a layer at least a ½ inch thick, you have enough plaster. Those who have never mixed up plaster before, this is an easy way to learn because you can't mess it up much. You're going to sift in enough plaster to cover the bottom and make a small island in the middle. When you store your plaster, try to store it in something that is airtight. We have this wonderful little wooden box over here that is out of camera, but it fits about 2 bags of plaster, and it's got a cute little lid. It's important that the plaster goes in slowly too. You don't want to just dump it all in at once. You want to try to get as much of the plaster to touch the water as you can. If it goes in too quick, you'll catch a lot of air. Now on a piece like this that we're making, the amount of air in it doesn't matter. If there's some bubbles, it's not a huge deal. The water that I used was warm because it doesn't matter if this sets up quick. If you wanted some working time with the plaster, you're going to use cooler water. So, and you see in there, see how there's that little island? It's kind of moved since I had to tip the bucket. But I'm going to let that sit for a second, and then I'm going to stir it around. So, we'll pause here for a second. Beep, beep, beep. Okay, so there's our plaster. I'm going to mix it up with my hand now. I want to try not to make a lot of bubbles. If you make some, it's okay, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to hit it with a mixer. So that's going to make a lot more bubbles than I need. Okay. That's good. Take my bin. We don't need to put anything in the bin. We don't need to put any release in. It's fine the way it is. And we're going to pour it in. We're going to pour it in slowly from one side. And that'll ensure that it fills in all the little gaps. So I've got a little extra plaster. I'm just going to leave it in the bucket, and when it starts to harden up, I'll scrape it out. I'm going to wiggle the plaster a little bit. You can see the bubbles come to the surface. Oh, I was going to move the camera, but it's stuck there. When those bubbles come to the surface, we can tap it. That'll get most of them off. And then the final thing is a spray bottle of alcohol. I can take, you can watch, I'll spritz just a little bit on it, and it breaks the surface tension of the bubbles, and they pop. I can do that a couple times, making sure I shake it after, because the surface tension will actually change the surface of the plaster. And there we go. Now we let that sit up, and we'll go to step 2. Here's our plaster. It's been sitting for about a half hour. I'm going to flip it over, hit it until it pops out, and then I'm going to clean up the plaster itself. So on the edges are sharp, and we don't want the little bits of plaster flaking off and getting in our clay. So we're going to take our shore form here, or our shredder, or whatever you want to call it, and we're just going to go along the edges. You don't have to take a lot off. We just don't want there to be extra plaster coming off. And then, I notice I'm doing it into my plaster waste bucket here. I'm going to wash it. Get it over here. And scrub down the surface to make sure there's nothing left that's going to come off. This will also help soak the plaster. Now, when you use this in the plastic bin, the plaster doesn't have to be like shiny wet, but it should be damp. And when you open it up, you should be like, oh, it's wet in there. So the reason this works is that this plaster is going to be radiating moisture until it saturates the environment in the bin. When it does that, the clay inside will not be able to dry out anymore because the atmosphere in there will be, 100% humidity. Also, another thing a plaster bat inside of a plastic bin can do is rehydrate stuff. So sometimes my students will, only have one piece on a board, they'll cover it up with plastic, and eventually it's going to dry out. And when it dries out on them, I can put it in one of my bigger magic boxes, and it'll actually re-wet it back to leather hard, which is pretty cool. I mean, when I was in school, I didn't have the ability to go backwards in time. Sometimes we would dip them and it would just dissolve the piece. But because there isn't any actual water touching the piece, it's just 100% humidity, it rehydrates it without dissolving it. A couple other concerns is that if you're using porcelain on the plaster, something chemically happens. I don't know, don't tell me, it's magic to me. The porcelain will actually eat into the plaster a little bit. And like all my pieces that I put on these are mostly round, and it'll leave a little round ring. I haven't found that it hurts the porcelain, it doesn't hurt the piece, and it doesn't change how these work. It's just something that I found one day. I was lifting up all these pieces, and it's like, oh, these little rings, oh no. But it was fine. And the last thing is to clean out your bin. So there'll be little edges of plaster. You just want to hit that with your scrubby and scrape them off. And rinse your bin out. Put your plaster back in it, and you've got your magic little damp box. Yay! And these can go to any size. We have some that are huge, and they work just as well. I just want to make sure there aren't lids in the top. The bigger ones usually have the lids either underneath that lip or on the top. Have fun!